Web3 kind of needs more rituals. Like we need more kind of constant, stable ways for people to not only get involved, but feel like they're supported.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're really aiming for in some ways with those rounds and with that cadence.
Hi everyone, it's Alimi and Jordan from NEWFORUM, a community podcast inviting purpose-driven creators, visionaries, developers, and investors to spark accessible conversations on the topics of crypto, the metaverse, NFT, and everything Web3. And on today's episode, we're super honored to have Scott Moore, co-founder of Gitcoin and KERNEL. He's also a pixel art and open source enthusiast.
We will be discussing and learning more about what quadratic funding is, opportunities as well as drawbacks, but also what the future holds in store for Gitcoin. So welcome, Scott, and thank you for joining us on this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So the first question really is, how did you get into Web3?
Yeah, wow. I mean, I think everyone has like kind of a rabbit hole story in terms of where they started. For me, honestly, it was, I kind of like talked about this a little bit before we got on, like there's a lot of really happenstance, and it actually had to do with Toronto, where I'm usually based as a city, being sort of the starting point for a lot of the Ethereum community back in sort of 2015, 2016. So a lot of those meetups were just kind of on the side, things that, you know, folks like Jeff Coleman or Nick Dodson were sort of hosting, incidentally, both of whom are like kind of responsible for a lot of the L2 work that's happening now. Nick running Fuel and Jeff kind of originating the idea of state channels back then, which were sort of the first scaling L2 sort of model. And ultimately, it was just kind of me just really getting nerd sniped by this idea of having a decentralized computer that can do all this kind of like, I guess, you know, really kind of more like agent-based collective intelligence kind of work. Like to me, a lot of the conversation that I was having in the machine learning space at the time was really around like, hey, like how do we build, you know, maybe new models for like lending that like automate away like processes that like we sort of all rely on. And I think there was sort of an opportunity to like discuss in that space more of the social science, more of the sort of like political science, even like the economics of like the systems that we're building, and that cross-disciplinary sort of nature of those conversations, and fundamentally like kind of human conversations, I think were what drew me to the space relative to, you know, in Web sort of 2, where we were sort of like trying to really push humans to the edges. That meetup space was really the first sort of starting point for me. And I ended up starting a few projects that were just mostly on the side at the time. The biggest one was kind of this thing called Venture Equity Exchange, where we were like, what if we could just get founders to collectively pool funds together and like kind of end up creating their own networks of different organizations. The DAO hack kind of happened around July 2016, unrelated, but shortly after, no one really wanted to talk about DAOs for a while. And so I sort of just kept building interesting side projects until actually eventually I was working on something kind of competitive, actually originally to Gitcoin. But after Kevin and I got to talking, we're just like, why don't we just work on this together and just start building this out? And so we ended up working together on what was first sort of a bounties platform. And now, of course, is really much more of sort of a quadratic funding platform. And yeah, everything's just sort of evolved from there.
So would you say it's like your passion for machine learning that kind of got you into the Web3 space back then, or just meeting the right people at the right time?
I think honestly, like I can't say that it was like a intentional journey. I think it was more so just that like the people, at the time were just so interesting and felt so eclectic and felt so lively relative to the work that I was doing. And I don't think this is just like a space, machine learning versus Web3. I don't think it's like a question of the spaces. I think it's just a question of like the people in those meetups just had such a breadth of interests and like understanding of these different spaces that it just kind of drew me in. And for me, I studied like political science and math in undergrad, which was like a really weird combination. So like I was naturally drawn to this sort of like community because I actually like never really encountered people in even that undergrad sort of set of courses who were interested in like these things together. It was a lot of like two different worlds. So yeah, happenstance, but also just like really cool folks.
Obviously, public goods are like at the center of Gitcoin's mission. Can you briefly like tell our community how public goods are defined? And you touched upon this a little bit, but what led to the creation of Gitcoin and the focus on public goods?
I'm going to actually answer the second one first, only because it's going to be a little bit easier. Like the public goods definition is one that that's a conversation that I'm very interested in and is very complicated to kind of unpack in a few ways. So for Gitcoin, we actually, as I mentioned, started as a bounties platform. We were actually really just trying to solve a problem for immediate users in Web3. And at the time, in the 2017, 2018 era of the space, there really wasn't much to do, candidly. Like there weren't many applications. So the idea that I had originally was much more sort of like, let's, get these repos onboarded to Web3. Let's like let them all kind of collectively value the work that they're doing and then have some auction to basically distribute rewards to contributors. And it was very involved. And at the time, you could never convince like a maintainer of a large repo that, hey, you should just suddenly spend like $10,000 in like the 2017 like peak prices to like deploy this contract onto your repo to like give this magic internet money to random people. And so the bounties approach was really a way for us to kind of test, hey, like, what does it look like to, at a very incremental, small level, get more people into Web3, get more people sort of building Web3. And it was actually quite successful at the time. And we ultimately ran into the problem, I think, of maintainers wanting to focus on, reviewing less PRs and wanting to focus more on their own vision for their projects. And that was what got us to like thinking about, Gitcoin grants as kind of a new tool. So ultimately, we ended up sort of shifting from just bounties into Gitcoin grants, which is where Quadratic Funding kind of came in. It just happened actually that Vitalik at the time had written a similar paper, or written a paper that actually like was really focused on Quadratic Funding, focused on this sort of like crowdfunding mechanism in a way that was similar to what we wanted to do, but just like way better in terms of the overall description and like novelty of the approach. So we ended up kind of just saying, well, we can focus on bounties, but let's really focus on this Quadratic Funding piece. And now you're kind of like, why public goods? Why are we like focused on public goods in this context? Well, I think, although we're trying to fund open source software first and foremost, I think the framing of open source software historically has been, I think it's been a mistake in the way that we framed it, which is like, oh, it's these people working for free on these things that, are just kind of passion projects, and they can just work on these and, we'll give them a few dollars in terms of donations somewhere and they'll be fine. I think what we wanted to kind of figure out with these incentives that we talk about in Web3, we talk about the nature of like kind of new community currencies. We talk about new incentive models for like the web. And if we're taking these things seriously, I think we have to like talk about, well, how do we make sure the maintainers that are actually building the software that like we're all using, things like now like Ethers.js or Wallet Connect, or even to some extent things like Uniswap, like more of the application layer, are like sustainably funded even before there really is a business model for them, before they're going to like go out and have, in this case, like Uniswap now has a token and a DAO and all these things. Like at the beginning, it was just an idea. It was just like, hey, I think this is cool and I should like experiment with it. And I think the notion of open source software that way, where it's just, hey, like we can just let these people work on these things and they'll get like small payments and so forth. I think that the reason it's problematic is that it forgets that like we're building so much on top of these things that's creating so much value. So I think actually even in Web 2, the amount of funding that we've kind of like, or the amount of value that's being generated from open source software is about $500 billion, I think annually. And we in turn have given like the maintainer of some of these core libraries, like, I don't know, like $10,000. And like, it's not really commensurate with the work that they've done. It doesn't really make sense long-term for the sustainability of this sort of software ecosystem we're working on. And it's not really conducive to trying to change the way that we fund things that are fundamentally in the public interest. So that's the answer to the second question. That's a lot there. But basically, we started as a bounties platform, kind of worked on Quadratic Funding as a way to help maintainers, ended up kind of in this position where it was starting to meaningfully fund in a sustainable way. We run these rounds quarterly using this model, maintainers in Web3. And the public goods framing that sort of spawned from that, because there wasn't the original intent, it was just open source software should be funded, was really around this sort of notion that I've kind of touched on of open source software creating positive externalities. So when we talk about sort of public goods historically, we've talked about public goods as things that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. And that's sort of the definition that like Paul Samuelson came up with in the 1950s. And non-excludability just means like you can't take something away from someone. So for example, you can't exclude someone, you can't like take some air away from someone, the air is just air. And it's non-rivalrous in the sense that you're not competing for air with someone else. It's abundant, it's plentiful. And that's a fine definition in a lot of ways, but most of the things we actually consider public goods are not that. So like a subway system is not that. An electrical grid is not that. A university is not that, right? I mean, people may or may not be accepted into the university. The university may or may not charge a fee. There's like lots of restrictions, lots of barriers. There's certainly competition, yet we would still call the university a public good, right? Like it's clearly good for the world and clearly, you know, something that states tend to fund pretty consistently across the board because we want people to be educated. We want educated people to go on to do really good things. And that is the positive externality that they actually create. So that's a long rant, but that positive externality framing is really, I think, where we're going with quadratic funding. So we started with this idea of let's get like individual contributors paid for their work. We went to let's get maintainers like the resources that they need, not try and solve a problem that like maybe isn't as fundamental to their livelihood and what they want to do with their project. And then let's try to, you know, make that a consistent way to fund other types of goods. Let's make quadratic funding something that can fund a broader pool of general things that we all care about, whether that's in Web3 itself or whether that's just more broadly in the world, right? Things like climate change, things like, you know, broader advocacy for certain policies around the world, things like the, you know, peace in Ukraine. These are causes that in theory, you can use a similar model of crowdfunding using community currencies to solve. So anyway, this is a long rant, but
an important rant. So you're spot on about like these definitions.
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah.
Public goods, there's like the general definition, the economic definition, but then when you dive deep, there's a lot that can be unpacked, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I just think that there's so much to the space that we have with Web3 to explore different incentives that like we shouldn't limit ourselves just to the idea of, oh, you like kind of press a button and you get like some work done. And I think that that's where we're sort of realizing there's much more to this collective intelligence kind of like agent-based local decision-making type of model than there is to just one-off arrangements between two people, like a marketplace, right? You almost don't want a marketplace anymore. I think the marketplace model is almost somewhat outdated. Like what you want is kind of a way to create almost like these like egregores that emerge from like local preferences, and you just create, you know, ways for local communities to really rally each other and come together to solve a problem. And you want to make that process for them to do that as seamless as possible. And by the way, I realize in this whole process, I haven't actually explained what quadratic funding does.
Right.
So I'm happy to dive into that as well. But yeah, I'll pause there and let you kind of like give some thoughts.
I do think that it will really do our community a lot of good to understand exactly what, you know, quadratic funding means and what are the main benefits of quadratic funding and why Gitcoin uses this.
The reason I thought that Vitalik's paper was just much more, I think, insightful was we originally thought of just doing a one-to-one sort of matching model. This is typical in traditional donations, charity, and so forth as well, where you just have, you know, a philanthropist that gives a certain amount of money, and then you have people basically donate individually, and ultimately you end up with, you know, matching according to the dollar amounts that are donated in a given set of for a given set of projects. But I think the more interesting thing is, how do you actually signal preferences amongst a group? And how do you make sure that that signal is kind of optimally meaningful? Like, how do you make sure that, like, if you let people signal their preferences and kind of like donate in order to do that? How do you make sure that you can actually like use that information, not just, to maybe distribute matching funds, but also in the future to help other people make decisions about how their community should distribute resources? So let's take a step back. Basically, quadratic funding is a kind of like mathematically optimal or sort of more democratic way to allow a philanthropist to put a set of funds aside and know that basically, according to, we usually do this over a 2-week period, a set of donations to a given set of projects, their funds will be distributed in a way that really maps to the preferences of that local community. So you know that if you have 20 projects and you spend this 2-week period with, say, 10,000 people donating to these 20 projects in various distributions, some people might donate to project 1, 3, 5, 7, whatever. Some people might donate just to like every project equally. You'll know that basically, as the sort of like philanthropist, your funds are going through to fund the community in a way that is according to their preferences, not yours. And I think that's a flip to like this traditional matching model, or even just to the traditional crowdfunding model in some ways, where, on the one hand, the philanthropist is kind of making the bulk of the decision. In effective altruism, this is at its extreme, where the philanthropist is entirely making the decision. In the crowdfunding case, the community is only making their decision with their own funds and has no external help from other providers or other kind of large scale funders. So this kind of meets those groups in the middle and gives them something where they can have this signaling mechanism, but also still have, some sense of broader support from communities that may not be directly tied to their own. So let's give an example of this, right? Just to like kind of simplify. Suppose that you want to, if you're Uniswap, understand what your community's preferences are, and then fund those so that you can build your own ecosystem. You should, as a Uniswap token holder, be like very incentivized to do that. But how do you actually know what people in that community want to see? Well, one, you could just poll them, and you could basically like, do an RFP sort of process and do a traditional grants program. But two, you could actually just let people, grassroots, put projects onto their own sort of interface, let people donate to those projects according to their own preferences, and then essentially dampen the results of that such that you're looking at the number of donations being made to things versus just the dollar amount, so that whale donations aren't making an outsized impact. And then you can take funding from your foundation or from other stakeholders in the Uniswap ecosystem who really care about this cause, who may not have the time to review all these different sorts of applications, and you can distribute funds in a way that just already maps to those preferences. And so I think there's something to the like grassroots, bottoms up collective way of funding, to this sort of way of funding that is kind of novel relative to both the effective altruism approach and the crowdfunding approach. I'll pause there. Like, I'm not sure if that like fully helps as an explanation, but it's essentially a democratic way to fund public goods, fund a local community's preferences, their shared needs, according to the community's own will.
I am curious about like what the main drawbacks could be, and what are the main critics, saying, because there's a lot online, so it'll be nice to kind of hear from you what has been like those drawbacks.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of real risk with relying only on community when it comes to very large scale decisions. And what I mean by that is, when you're a Uniswap and you want to like use this as a way to fund your own local community preferences, there's a real sense of community that you can identify based on, how active are these people in the community. Even in some cases, although it may be plutocratic, like how many tokens does this person hold? Those are things that can give you a sense of how invested, how actively does someone care about a given set of projects, and therefore like, how much will their preferences really matter? So for example, like projects in a category like climate change, there's a lot of people who care deeply about that subject and want to see it solved. But I think there's also a lot of people who may not really have like the domain expertise to understand which solutions are providing the most impact in that space. And, climate change is kind of an interesting example because it's such a global scale problem. and so many people care about it. So the number of people who have domain expertise is often a lot smaller than the number of people who care about it. And so I think like a good like steelman against quadratic funding would be that you need to have some good way to like filter out projects that are not really intentionally or like effectively focused on solving a problem at hand, like climate change. And to do that, you need to have some filtering mechanism that's pretty strong. And in an ideal form, like a kind of like pure form of quadratic funding, you don't really have those domain experts. So one thing we've tried to do to like rectify this has been in any given category, in any given round, we tend to allow a group of experts, a group of folks in that community to be responsible for setting criteria that they'll then use to decide who is actually in this round, who's actually doing meaningful work in this area, such that they should be involved in this kind of like 2-week period where people donate, and then we sort of distribute the philanthropic funds accordingly. And I think that's been really helpful in making sure that we have some sort of way to ensure that there's a balance between one thing that quadratic funding is really good at by default is that it tends to surface a lot of projects that people otherwise wouldn't find. So like back in the day, Austin Griffith, who now does a lot of Ethereum developer relations work, was just kind of toying around with random ideas. And I think at one point, Vitalik even said like, oh, I don't know who this guy is and why he got so much money, but like he seems to be doing good work. And then, now he's working with the Ethereum Foundation, actively involved. So there's this degree of discovery that happens, which is really valuable. But on the other hand, you need to balance that with making sure that the quality, the average quality and like efficacy of things funded is meaningful. And that's where I think there's often, again, like a bit of a divide. So that sort of model of including domain experts in the selection process for the round pre kind of curation, like before the round starts, before you start allowing donations in, has been really helpful.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, Scott, but you mentioned a round, and I know Salim had a follow-up question too, but in terms of a round, maybe you could explain how a round works, because obviously those that are familiar will know, but someone else might not necessarily.
Yeah, for sure. So a round is just a way to, we have this model of quadratic funding, which is just, this sort of democratic way to fund public goods, et cetera. We have this problem of, well, how do you know when the community has actually signaled their preferences effectively enough or sufficiently that you can start to allocate the philanthropic funds? How do you know that like basically you can allocate the philanthropic funds and it will be done in a way that like actually represents the community? So there's many ways you can do this, but the 2-week period that we usually run these rounds for turns out to be a pretty good proxy, essentially for the round to when the round will reach a saturation point. And what we mean by a saturation point is just when will the round basically reach a point where the kind of total amount of funding that is available from the matching funders, from the sort of like, in this case, philanthropists, is so quote unquote used up, i.e. the total donations and then the calculations on those donations that, which is just in a naive sense, the sum of the square roots of contributions. When will those contributions basically like accurately describe the preferences of the community? We actually are kind of interested in experimenting with different round size and like periods, but we've historically tried to do these 2-week periods every quarter, just as a way to keep a cadence to let the community sort of know, hey, like if you have a project and you need funding, like we're around and we will like continue to persist these rounds so that you can, find success in the long run. I think one of the problems that occur with whether it's like traditional grants programs in Web3, whether it's even like, I'm sure like, and I might be diving a little bit deep in the weeds, but like even for like artists or creators who might be listening, like the process of going and trying to apply for a grant and then being like, well, even if you get the grant, maybe like, which is like question mark on whether or not that will actually happen, right? The ability to know that, hey, I'm going to have, this funding for 6 months, and then I'm of course going to be able to reapply and I'll have this extra set of funding that I can use and continue with. That certainty, that kind of sense of stability is really missing from grants, I think, overall. And I think that's something that we want to at least try to rectify with the way that we structure these the sort of like rounds and each of these, the sort of like rhythm of what we're building here. So I think Web3 kind of needs more rituals. Like we need more kind of constant, stable ways for people to not only get involved, but feel like they're supported.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're really aiming for in some ways with those rounds and with that cadence.
Amazing. Speaking about Web3 crowdfunding and all of that, I can't help but think of DAOs, like, because if I'm a newbie in the space, I'm wondering like, oh, this sounds kind of familiar. Like, how is it connected to DAOs, and is it a DAO, and how does all this work? And I think that next part of the question is if you could also explain what quadratic voting is, that would be really good too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so DAOs are like, that's a rabbit hole on its own, I think. And, I think DAOs are fascinating because they mean so many things at this point, but they're also this like kind of almost tabula rasa, like there's this sort of like sense that we've dropped all this semantic baggage from previous ways of thinking about organizations. And, Gitcoin is now itself a DAO, and we're still evolving and thinking about what that means. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is actually, by Conway's law, kind of run the organization the same way that we are trying to run the rounds. If we're going to use quadratic funding successfully, then the organization should mirror the same sort of democratic processes that the tooling aspires to allow for. So if we basically create a organization where people can vote on individual types of rounds that we might fund, on the way that, for example, one thing that I haven't really done a deep dive on, which is probably too much to go into, is like civil resistance, like the way in which we define what contributions are valid. If you have a democratic model and you have one person pretending to be 10 people, that really influences results at scale if you have a lot of people doing that. So just how do you avoid and measure those things in a way that is kind of clear to the community, for one, but also that the community can ratify and agree to. And then also, in the long run, are the other types of models we should be pursuing? Because we sort of talked about this at the very beginning, like quadratic funding is one of many types of collective intelligence mechanisms, fundamentally agent-based mechanisms, versus maybe, I don't know, you could say something like Stable Diffusion is very like algorithmic. It's very like, we want the machine to go back into its own world and figure out, like, use all this data to like basically pull out the best possible sort of image from its own sort of like database, its own world of information. I think quadratic funding is one example of a type of collective decision-making.
You mentioned a very important term, which is collective intelligence. And this is, I think, the perfect moment. There's something that you wrote recently on Twitter, which is the beauty of quadratic funding is that it allows us to manifest a kind of collective intelligence. And what's really interesting about this is if you think of the Web3 space in general, I'm not sure that the first thing that comes to mind is collective intelligence. You mentioned that we have to build rituals. And I think the most known ritual is to say good morning on Twitter. So how do you go from everyone saying good morning to having an interest in quadratic funding and voting? Because everyone can see different things on Twitter, but I rarely see posts about quadratic funding, or if it is, it's more as a meme of, do you know what quadratic funding is? So how do we really build this collective intelligence? And do you think Web3 and overall, even outside of Web3, the interest is there?
Yeah, I think we're still very, the hard part about a lot of these tools we're building is that you really need to, and I definitely am not like, always the best at this. You need to be able to like really distill down the kind of like core of these concepts to folks. Like GM is such a simple kind of concept and like way of just being on Twitter or on Discord. I think we sort of have really tried to create a meme and ritual around just, hey, there's a bunch of projects here in a given period that you should think about funding. Some of them might be climate change related and have a matching pool related to that. Some of them might be related to the funding of sort of like broader advocacy. Some of them might be, infrastructure projects. And they don't need to know a lot about actually the way that quadratic funding itself works. What they kind of need to know is like, hey, like if you put in $1 here, then like by this mechanism, there will be, X many dollars that are donated to this project from this broader pool that's being raised, partly from the DAO itself, partly from other like matchers in the ecosystem, folks like Uniswap itself, folks like Yearn, folks like, just generally like the Ethereum Foundation and Optimism have been huge partners in past rounds.
That still entails like a level of understanding, right? Like you need to know, for example, how Uniswap works. I don't know how many people would understand what it is. Obviously, I would hope most in the audience would, but like what is Uniswap, how exchanges work. And as you said, you don't need to know the ins and outs of quadratic funding, but you still need to know like the core concept of when you're supporting a project, what is the mechanism behind? Why can you trust it, right? So can we really build this trust? Because Web3 in general is all about trust, right? Or at least that's what we're working towards.
Yeah. I mean, the DAOification of Gitcoin has been hopefully a right step in that direction, which is to say that like, I think we've been able to get more people involved in the process of like kind of checking, hey, like, how are you doing Sybil resistance? How are you checking whether or not someone is the person they say they are? That's like what the Passport, Gitcoin Passport, and sort of similar sort of identity aggregator models are doing. There's a lot of other identity projects doing this, like Ceramic and so forth, which the Passport actually uses. There's the question of, letting people get involved in even defining public goods, because we've sort of decided, hey, we should, maybe run a climate round. We should maybe run a Ethereum infrastructure round, and the DAO is deciding this, but the sort of framework even for this sort of like what kind of goods are creating positive externalities came partly from the DAO's own exploration of this sort of philosophical space. And I think there's something to that sort of even like pseudonymous like transparency that is really helpful in getting people like kind of to understand what's happening. But I still think, like there's a lot of work to be done in terms of honestly just on all fronts in Web3 simplifying. Even for me, like I find that, to be a challenge, certainly. Like the idea of simplifying UX, simplifying the kinds of terminology we use, simplifying the sort of like number of different kind of like objects people have to hold in memory, like things that people have to just like keep in mind, because there's always a billion things happening on Twitter or on every other channel. In Web3, there's this sense of constant missing out. So I think it's a really hard problem, honestly. And I think that like it's certainly one that we want to like keep working on.
You mentioned like we need to make it obviously the space more simple. So what do you think are the solutions? Because obviously one thing that comes to mind is gamification. That seems to be working pretty well to make the space simpler. But Gitcoin has been really good at actually creating a narrative that is not necessarily gamified, but through the support, like Vitalik and everyone's starting to understand what quadratic funding is, right? But what do you think are the next steps, except of course, like really good documentation that you can find on the Gitcoin website? But what do you think are really the next steps to either gamify or create a story the same way? To take a recent example of Starbucks, right? They're creating their Odyssey, Starbucks Odyssey, and they didn't use the word NFT, right? And someone that knows NFTs would right away be like, oh, this is an NFT kind of thing. But they're not using it, and they're talking more to a broader global community. So when it comes back to Gitcoin, what do you think are the next steps for Gitcoin in general? To like, is it the goal to go global or more to cater to the Web3 space? And how do we simplify it for the Web3 space that is not necessarily educated?
Yeah, I actually think the more I think about it, and I think this is a very good question. It's one that we're like grappling with a lot in the DAO at large. The easiest way to solve this problem, I think, so right now, Gitcoin is still a little bit of a monolith. The main platform, the Gitcoin Grant sort of program, the thing we run quarterly runs on, is run by sort of like, still kind of a team within the DAO. There's still a lot of operational work that goes into that. I think we often try to, including in the context of like, us sort of saying, hey, we're going to solve like for every kind of public good imaginable. We're going to, help create rounds to solve climate change and so forth, which by the way, I think are like important problems to solve. I think what we're getting to, and this is where we're sort of like evolving into a protocol, is to a world where anyone can spin up their own versions of these sort of mechanisms for collective, like grassroots sense making and crowdfunding in a way that isn't going to require the entire world to understand what they're doing. And I think that the ultimate outcome of that is that you have many of these different local communities who have very, very high context on the thing and kind of problem space that they're trying to solve, and have a lot of context on, hey, these are the grantees and kinds of projects that are in our community that we should like put up here for funding. And then our job becomes really, how do we figure out which of these rounds to really support? How do we figure out how to more deeply involve and like kind of flag these things for philanthropists and other large funders to get involved with? And I think that's where we solve this divide that I talked about a little bit earlier of like, okay, you can have this top-down effective altruist, like solve every problem as, you know, the billionaire philanthropist, or the bottoms-up crowdfunding, like let's like, you know, create a massive crowdfunding campaign to like solve climate change. Like both of those have problems as approaches. But if you let local communities basically decide their own shared needs and then solve for those, you have domain expertise out of the box. Like people know their own local communities in their own local context. You have a lot of ways for people to feel empowered to share their preferences with that community and to fund things accordingly. And then the only thing you're missing really is this broader matching funding, which I think is still where the, you know, DAO and Gitcoin comes in. And so to simplify, like think local is maybe like the best way to sort of frame that. And I think that's the direction we're going with, sort of like the, you know, allowing anyone to fork the program, create their own version of the program, and to support their own local communities.
You just finished the 15th round of Gitcoin, and we're curious to know like what happens next, and are there any grand projects or directions you are most excited about for Gitcoin in the future, in the near future?
Yeah, I think there are almost like 7,000 or so, like 8,000 grantees on there right now. So it's definitely hard to like pick like specific ones. I will shout out to ones that have maybe not graduated, but have like consistently become and continue to become like very important parts of the Ethereum community. So we just, you know, Ethereum just had the merge. That was a huge moment for the Ethereum community at large. That was partly the efforts of groups like Prism, Prismatic Labs, Lighthouse, Nimbus, other clients that basically are now part of sort of the network in the context of ETH2. They were all funded in part by Gitcoin grants originally. There's projects like Wallet Connect, which if you've ever used Rainbow on the very back end, that's like what's powering a lot of the actual work that Rainbow's doing. And that's actually a good case study to me of a success story where it's like people don't know Wallet Connect, which is I think ideal actually. Like we should have more of those sorts of interfaces that are just sort of like working on the back end. I think, you know, if something's working really well, people don't know that it's working at all, right? And I think that's kind of an example of that. Certainly Uniswap, which was also an early grantee, I think is being very successful. And of course, a lot of these are no longer grantees, right? They've graduated from that into becoming their own sorts of sustainable organizations, which is actually an important point, which kind of is implicit in the positive sum, like positive externalities framing of public goods. But, you know, public goods can be sustainable. They can be almost like, you know, profitable. This is the sort of framing that optimism uses. And I think that's one thing that, whether it's artists or open source developers, people are very reluctant to accept. People don't, it's almost a trauma around like money, around like having any kind of funding that I think is like needs to be kind of like worked through. But I think that's where like we're sort of going to answer your question. It's just like we're going towards you know, beyond these success stories, we're going to these communities hopefully becoming their own fully fledged sustainable ecosystems that then fund their own local communities using this protocol, right? They become their own sort of shelling points for decision making instead of us being kind of at the center of a lot of it, which we are now.
You talked a bit about how Gitcoin is becoming a DAO and, you know, a community sort of like co-creating in everything. But maybe you can touch, you know, a bit on this idea of like how Gitcoin has evolved over time. And I'm also curious to know what you're looking forward to the most in Web3.
Yeah, I mean, so to answer the DAO question, like I think Gitcoin is really aimed at, you know, the goal of the DAO, I think, should be to decentralize power as much as possible to the edges. I think sometimes people conflate that with structurelessness or there being like no structure to the organization. I think we've aimed to kind of create a model where you still have kind of work streams or groups that have individual autonomy over decision making, that then have sort of accountability in a democratic way to the broader community and to a broader group. And I think that's a process that's ongoing of like, how do we basically give more power to these work streams, ensure that these work streams are healthy, ensure that over time we have a kind of like sense of that they're working towards what we've like kind of created as these essential intents, which have to do with how helping communities fund their shared needs. I think that's going well. I think that like that's sort of like being a learning process around what does it mean to build a decentralized community, decentralized organization, and so forth. But fundamentally, Gitcoin as a DAO is, you know, sort of people will call these like protocol DAOs, right? And that's sort of like the direction we've started to go. There's a lot more honestly like to dive into in terms of like my thoughts on DAOs, which are there's a lot of nuance to that. But to answer your question about like what am I excited about in Web3, I think that probably is like, you know, the major area for me is just like, I think I hate to be like that, like, you know, kind of Twitter influencer person, like we're so early. But like, I do feel like we're very early on DAOs. And I think there's going to be lots of different types of these organizations solving very different problems. For us, our hope is that we can kind of solve these, this sort of like grants giving part of the sort of like puzzle for a lot of these orgs. I think other big piece is just experimenting with sort of like new local ways to organize like activism, like Ukraine DAO is an example of this, which I think is like being quite successful. There's sort of other more infamous examples of this, like Constitution DAO, where they, you know, tried to buy a copy of the Constitution. A bunch of people tried to YOLO together. I thought that was a really interesting like exploration, even though it was maybe like not quote unquote like a success. I think honestly, like the biggest thing that's exciting to me would be better explained by like Vitalik just wrote this really great piece on sort of the future of DAOs. And, you know, one thing he kind of notes is that he thinks that there'll be a lot of very core enduring institutions, like a kind of handful of those. And there'll be then, of course, like a lot of more sporadic organizations that come and go from there. And I guess like what I'm very excited to see is like, how can we best understand like one, like what institutions we have now, what role they're playing, and think about that as a community and hopefully like help those organizations endure. But then two, how can we start to really define, you know, when those organizations are successful, like what we expect of them as a community, and like what are the norms and sort of social values that we create. And of course, for me, one of the most important ones there is like funding public goods, like helping ensure that DAOs, when they're, you know, funding their own local communities, are also funding these other broader needs of the community, whether that's like on the Ethereum side, like the core protocol development itself or core infrastructure that we're all using, whether that's like the broader sort of like, you know, like climate, whether that's things like advocacy, like I mentioned. I think those are all like really big open questions, which I framed in terms of DAOs, but I think are just generally part of this shift away from existing institutional modes of working. Like there's a great comment someone made a while ago, I forget who this was, but they were like, where's like the, you know, Federal Reserve Discord channel? And I think that like, that's kind of silly, but like, it's kind of true that like, I think we have different expectations of institutions now. And I think we haven't really articulated them or like solidified them amongst ourselves. So like, let's leverage the fact that DAOs are these sort of more flexible, kind of novel institutional frameworks to start to set those expectations and start to like kind of build those norms with each other. And I think that's beyond the more practical, okay, what are the types of DAOs that are out there? How are they working? How do we improve them? That's like the really interesting, more sort of philosophical framing that I'm very interested in.
I'm going to go with this thought, like leveraging DAOs. I think that's really powerful. And I want to thank you so much, Scott. This is really insightful, very informative. And actually, before we go, where can our community find you on your social platforms?
Just Twitter is, I think, probably the best. Not Scott Moore just is my default there. I'd also recommend just people who want to find out more about what we're up to check out gov.gitcoin.co, which is like our governance forum. And in general, I think that there's so much great writing on sort of the future of these sorts of subjects in the space that, I can't recommend one area, but I would definitely recommend that piece on vitalik.ca, his personal site on sort of the future iterations of DAOs. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Amazing, Scott. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jordan. And thank you all for being a part of today's forum. If you want to get more involved in our community, make sure to follow us on our social platforms. Twitter is NEWFORUM_NCO, and we're NEWFORUM.io and NEWLive.io. You can also join our Discord community to connect with our guests. You'll find the links in the description as well as Scott's links as well. And if you want to learn more about the New Foundation ecosystem, go to newcoin.org. And as always, take a moment, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And we will see you in the next episode. Thank you.